Dr. Kurt Harris with the University of Georgia's Institute for Disaster Management. In today's segment, we're going to be talking about some of the legal authorities and implications that go along with an infectious disease outbreak. Today, I'm joined by the Associate General Counsel for the Georgia Department of Public Health, Zan Faruqi. Zan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kurt.
So Zan, before we jump into some of the legal authorities that go along with this, how about you tell us a little bit about your role within the Georgia Department of Public Health?
Sure. I'm the Associate General Counsel for the Department of Public Health, and I provide legal guidance and advice to the department on emergency preparedness matters before and during emergencies.
With that, I know that you helped to develop a toolkit, a legal toolkit that goes along with infectious disease outbreaks. So can you tell us a little bit about that toolkit?
Yeah, Kurt. It was a document that we developed during our Ebola response. It essentially summarizes the legal framework to isolate and quarantine people in this state. It includes templates for orders and agreements when conducting those measures.
So you mentioned legal authorities that are in the toolkit. Can you describe some of the legal authorities that are actually in the toolkit for us?
Sure. So the state has broad statutory authority in the state to protect the public's health, to prevent the spread of the disease. Generally speaking, the department has the ability to institute control measures or social distancing measures, which is basically limiting groups of people from coming together. And some of those control measures can be done voluntarily or through administrative orders, which must be complied with. Examples of those control measures are isolation and quarantine.
Often people use these words synonymously or they actually use them incorrectly, and there's a lot of fear and stigma that actually goes along with these terms. Could you please define what isolation and quarantine mean?
Sure, Kurt, you're right. These terms are used interchangeably and they're not defined by law. Essentially, in practice, they look the same. They are government-imposed restrictions on a person's movement in order to prevent the spread of disease. So simply put, isolation is separating people who are sick or have symptoms from other people in order to prevent the spread of the disease. Quarantine is separating people who may have been exposed or reasonably exposed to an illness, who have yet not shown any signs of symptoms or of that disease. Sometimes these control measures are used to confine people to a particular location, like their home or medical facility, or place restrictions on their behavior or movement. So for example, they may have to report and take their temperature or symptoms. They may not be allowed to have people in their home, or they may be restricted from going on public conveyances or public transportation.
So very simply put, if they're ill, then they're isolated, and if they're questionable, then they're quarantined.
Right.
So you mentioned in the toolkit that there's a lot of authorities that are related to Ebola, that the toolkit was actually generated in response to Ebola. So do the authorities affect only Ebola, or are they specific to various diseases, or is it kind of a general disease state?
So in Georgia, this authority applies to any infectious or communicable disease dangerous to the public. However, whether public health actually implements any of these control measures like isolation and quarantine really depends on the specific disease and whether or not there's medical or clinical basis to actually take those measures. Compelling someone to be restricted of their movement or isolated or quarantined is a serious matter. We don't take that lightly. So there must be some evidence that a person is a danger to the public based on their either exposure to a disease or actual illness before we take any measure to isolate or quarantine somebody.
Most of what we've talked about so far has had to deal with state authorities, but we also have the local level and the local county boards of health. So what authorities do they have within an infectious disease response, and does that differ than the state?
So the county boards of health also have broad statutory authority and power to protect the public's health within its jurisdiction. And that authority includes restricting the movement of people in order to prevent the spread of disease. The county boards of health do have the authority to isolate people, but they do not have the authority under the law to quarantine. That authority is reserved for the state.
So it seems to me it could be difficult to get people to voluntarily isolate or quarantine. So when you enact these orders, do most people comply with isolation and quarantine when it comes to serious communicable diseases?
So Kurt, these measures are designed to protect the individual and the public. And generally, in most cases, people want to comply and they want to voluntarily agree to be isolated and quarantined. Now, we certainly want to encourage voluntary compliance as much as possible and provide as much information about the risks of the disease and the urgency of the disease. But there are situations in which people may not be cooperative, or they may not comply, or want to be quarantined or isolated. And in those situations, we do have a couple options available to us. Public health can seek local law enforcement assistance to help enforce a public health order, or we can go before a judge and seek a court order for an injunction.
So Zan, as we conclude this interview, what would be your take-home message to our first responder communities who are likely to make that first contact with a patient with a serious communicable disease?
I think the important thing to understand is that the authority to isolate and quarantine people is with the Department of Public Health or local county boards of health. Local first responders are not expected to make those legal decisions as to whether or not a person needs to be restricted or isolated or quarantined. We may request support from first responders However, this partnership between public health and first responder community is really there to protect you as a first responder as well as the citizens of Georgia.
So Zan, thank you for your time and for clarifying these remarks. We really appreciate all you do with the Georgia Department of Public Health.
It's great to be here, Kurt.